Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. If you found us, it's possible that you were searching for this subject, or maybe you stumbled upon us. It's a very important subject, and we're talking about today PTSD. We're picking up from our conversation with psychologist Dr. Roger Lavine from last week, and so impactful, so many details, and so much more to unpack here. Roger, welcome back. How are you?
I'm great. Yourself, Steve?
I'm well. And this PTSD, we talked a lot about it last time we got together, but what if somebody starts with some treatment and finds it's not working, or they feel it's not working? Where do they go from there?
Well, I think, of course, depends on what they're trying to do with it, right? I think the more traditional way of dealing with it is one of the ways, of course, is medication. And I think at some point, if the medication isn't getting you to where you want to go, you have to start looking at what kind of therapy or what kind of therapist might be helpful.
How would that vary? How would you make that determination of what type of therapy that you would use or get for your particular type of PTSD? Or is PTSD comes from different reasons, but the treatment is essentially going to be the same no matter where it comes from?
Well, I think the pretty much the when you talk to your therapist, you can ask, what school they come from, right? And then the most basic place that most therapists can start is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And what happens with cognitive behavioral therapy is that they learned a lot about trauma, and kind of it evolved into what's called trauma-focused therapy. And there's a whole bunch of trauma-focused therapy. So when you talk to the therapist, they might talk about trauma-focused as a label. They might talk about flooding. They might talk about EDMR. And all these therapies, their strength is that if you can go through them, they're relatively quick, somewhere between maybe 12 weeks and half a year, right? 26 weeks.
Okay.
The problem is that they only have attrition rates up to 45 or 50%. Half the people have a hard time tolerating those things. So if one of the things that you're really, really having a problem with is talking about it or being really overwhelmed about your trauma, and if you're using one of those therapies and it just isn't working for you, then what's now evolved is more mind-body based or mindfulness cognitive based therapies, where it may take you a little longer, but it's actually based on neuroscience, and it's designed towards retraining your brain. So if the medication doesn't work, if the CBT doesn't work, if your trauma focus doesn't work, you might want to give a shot at a more mindfulness-based approach to post-traumatic stress.
Can we look at, you mentioned CBT. Can we look at what exactly that is, how that works?
Well, the one underlying cornerstone of every therapy that works for any form of anxiety, including PTSD, is exposure therapy, right? So they learned decades ago in cognitive behavioral therapy that you needed to be exposed to the things that triggered you to get past them for processes of extinction to take place. The challenge with exposure is just tolerating it.
Why is it so challenging to tolerate it?
Because when we get triggered back to that event, we can get so much adrenaline and cortisol, we go right to panic attack.
Mm.
Or we can just go to high levels of fear, and the more adrenaline and cortisol, the less the cognitive part of behavioral therapy, CBT works. The C is for cognitive, because once we get to a certain level of arousal, we can't think clearly.
Is it true that the only way to make these therapies work is you have to go back? You're going to talk about it. The potential for the trigger is of the trauma is going to be there.
Yeah, I think the exposure to the trauma is needed at some level to rewire the brain. And then I think the core of all post-traumatic stress comes back to the fact that the trying to make some kind of sense or meaning out of it.
Okay, so you now as the individual that's dealing or dealt with PTSD, you're back there again. Now you're trying to figure it out, and that's where things go haywire, can be very challenging. That's what I'm getting from you.
For example, we talked about a young woman who her boyfriend taped her legs and hands and threatened her to get her credit cards because he was seeking some drugs, right?
Hmm.
Trying to make sense of that and why it happened to you and all that kind of stuff is a really daunting task. Or even it could be something as simple as a car accident, and now maybe you lost a limb.
Hmm.
So how do you make sense of why did this happen to me? What's this mean to my life? What does it mean for me going forward? All those things.
I can see how painful it can be as you try to, and you want to get out of, or I would think the best case scenario is to get out of the victim mode. Why me? Why did this happen to me, to move forward? But not easier said than done.
Yeah, I think a better explanation for victim mode really is the why me's and all that kind of stuff is all an attempt to escape the intense discomfort of thinking about it, right? We call it undoing. Why did this happen to me? If I could come up with a better story, it wouldn't have happened. It's illogical, but it's a natural way we try to escape our emotions.
Hmm. What, in your opinion, would be the best type of therapy for PTSD? Just, every situation is different, but overall.
Well, I practice the more mindfulness based approach. Um, there's actually 8 cognitive in mind body skills in my program, but the reason for that is that when you're done, you actually have skills to handle any type of emotion and not just this one trauma. In other words, you'll end up being a much calmer person, much more peace of mind, much more comfortable with your life, and be able to handle situations going forward. It makes the situation so whatever happened to you actually turned out to your benefit because you're a better person on the other side of it.
Hmm. Yeah, it sounds totally reasonable in that you're learning what happened, but also learning how to deal with what happened, as opposed to just going back, confronting the trigger, the trauma, and then trying to move forward. Because it's going to come up again, and they might not be with you. Now, what do you do?
Correct.
Hmm. Where do you go from there? Let's say somebody's been in treatment for, say 20 weeks, and there's been improvement. What's the long-term situation with PTSD?
So, for myself, one of the things that was a big moment for me was I'd gotten to the point where one day I'm just going along and a car came really close to me, and I didn't have a startle response. And it made me think, wow, not only am I not coming 6 inches off the ground, but I'm not irritable. I'm not having those nightmares. I'm sleeping all the way through the night. It's like, it was an aha moment. I'm on the other side of this thing, right? It wasn't plaguing me every day with all these little moments.
Let's look at it a situation. I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation. Can there be PTSD from it? Now we're talking about significant traumas in somebody's life. What if you were happily married or thought you were, and then let's say your spouse just said, "Yeah, I want a divorce. That's it," and then you find out things are going on. Um, in a situation like that, could you have PTSD in further relationships? Could there be some lingering effects from a situation like that?
Well, let me just add a little bit more to your scenario to turn it into a PTSD scenario.
Sure.
Say in that scenario, you were actually married to an extremely emotionally abusive person who really traumatized you during the relationship and then really went after you in the divorce. Now, you'll have more going on than just PTSD, right?
Sure.
And I think that's one of the things that uh, complicates almost all therapy because people don't show up as a pure case of PTSD or a pure case of anything. But what happened in that case, right, is that more than likely um, there was a lot more going on. There was a lot more traumas. It could have been a trauma in the relationship and the way they were abused, right? But there could have been a trauma before that that set them up even to be in that kind of relationship. So the PTSD events don't necessarily have to be like the car accident or death in a war. They can be any situation where the you're in fear for your life and you can't it happens so intensely or so strongly you can't make sense of it, and you have PTSD because you become hyper vigilant. You're looking for that next shoe to drop. You may have nightmares, right? You may have a startle response. You'll probably be irritable. So those are kind of the hallmarks. Oh, this thing left me with PTSD versus maybe just a bad marriage and a bad divorce. You won't have that hypervigilance, but you may have a lot of anxiety about another relationship or what people think of you, and it'll be a more generalized kind of anxiety.
And the reason I asked you that question, Roger, I wanted to go for a more less tumultuous situation where just something happened in somebody's life. And could they be left with something that's PTSD connected? For example, in that example where somebody thought their marriage was okay, their partner just decided we're done. And then maybe they were cheating and you found it out, whatever. From that point forward, could you be triggered in other relationships? Let's say somebody, like an abandonment situation.
Yeah.
What I'm doing here is, can you have PTSD even from a situation like that? Because we know we can get it from other ones. You talked about,
Yeah. Again, if there's enough abuse in it, yes.
so there has to be some type of abuse to
Well,
really
some
call it
kind of trigger where you feel your safety is very threatened.
safety.
Right. But here's where it comes up more often, where is people who have like maybe ADHD or a substance abuse problem. They're bumbling through life with what this other issue. They have a traumatic event. They have PTSD. It partially resolves, right? But now they're working on their PTSD, or they're working on their ADHD, or they're working on their substance abuse problem, and now it's showing its head later. So what happens with a lot of people is they can partially resolve, right? You're not you're gonna, after the trauma, you're gonna get, quote, better, right? But you can be left with a lot of lingering effects that don't show up till later, or complicate dealing with something else. Or you might show up in a couples counseling, right? And having trouble with your spouse over a trauma that you brought to the relationship. And now it's causing a problem in the relationship because you never resolved it. So I see PTSD making dealing with other situations more complicated. Or I've even had people show up who had partially resolved, and they came because their boss said, if you don't improve your disposition, you're going to lose your job.
Can that be PTSD? Can you get it
And
from
that
that?
can be PTSD, just a
Oh,
very irritable, guarded person, not playing well with others, that kind of thing in a work situation. So they come to me and their boss is saying to me, you got to get some anger management. And it turns out to be PTSD.
wow. And that's where I was going with this, because I wonder if many of us, or a lot of us, are dealing with a PTSD situation, but we don't see it that way because the catalyst wasn't really in our minds super traumatic. Same thing in the example I gave. Like, yeah, later in life, you go into a relationship, and now there are things that may trigger you. Let's say, you feel that somebody is not being honest. Could that be a trigger from a PTSD situation, from somebody maybe cheating on you? And what you said, sure, surely, somebody brings those situations into a relationship. Let's say your father left you and your family just abandoned you, and now you bring that into a relationship. I would imagine, based on what we're talking about, that could even be a PTSD situation that would hamper your life in another relationship.
Yeah, the whole issue of how your PTSD occurs, lots of times people don't even know, is I think the point you're getting to.
Yeah, yeah.
And also we all want to believe that we're past whatever problem we have, right?
Of
Oh, that
course.
happened 3 years ago, or that happened 5 years ago. I'm all good, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and you don't think of it as being, yeah, it bothered me. That was a problem, but you don't think of it in terms of PTSD. Maybe there's triggers there, but you said the word safety. Is PTSD? Well, I guess, you know what? When we look at it, safety in that situation, you want to feel safe in a relationship. And if you've been done wrong and it affected you in a big way, that could be safety as well. Safety of
Yeah,
your emotions, right?
exactly.
Okay.
I had a young woman who came in. She was having a lot of trouble with her family and her current relationship. And what it went back to was she saw her sister getting abused when they were kids.
Mm,
And some of the things that were going on were triggering her from that vicarious experience of her sister's abuse.
wow. Yeah, this can run deep, take shape in forms of all different areas.
Well, I
Um,
think that's the big thing with PTSD is there's the experiences you have, which can trigger it, but also you can vicariously get it. That's why,
hmm,
firemen or policemen, or even if you see a bad situation, or say, you're in a medical profession, it can be triggered when you're just seeing somebody else's uh, trauma.
wow. Which gives us a lot to think about when you say, as we try to look at our lives, and when we try to answer that question, why do I act the way I act when that happens? Maybe it's connected to a PTSD situation. If it's not PTSD, Truly PTSD. What would it be? Just a trigger?
Just fear.
Just fear? Okay.
So you, from a clinical perspective, right, we have a number of presentations where fear is kind of out of control, and we label them differently with different diagnosis because sometimes the treatment is a little different or the etiology is different, right? So if you say you had uh, your bad situation with a divorce, right? Um, in some cases, it can be just an adjustment disorder with anxiety. In other words, you're suffering the next few months from a lot of anxiety just because of the situation you were going through, and you're having trouble adjusting. Or it could be now generalized, meaning that now you're anticipating things going bad. So it's not only just one thing that's bothering you, but everything you're anticipating
Yeah.
being bad. So the thing with the fear response is it can present itself in different ways, and we have different diagnosis, and then that affects how we treat it a little differently.
How do you know that it's truly PTSD from a clinical perspective?
Well, I think primarily the symptom I look for is the constant state of uneasiness we call hypervigilance.
Hmm.
And a third of the cases, there's derealization and depersonalization. So it's a very intense emotion. So you pretty much, if you're having trouble with, things not seeming real or not feeling like a real person, then definitely I would explore to see if that was something.
Hmm. And I think we skimmed upon that last time we got together, where that feeling of something, this doesn't feel real. I feel like I'm in a dream. What's going on there psychologically when somebody feels that?
They just can't take any more reality, and they're distancing their minds, distancing them to protect them from the intense feelings.
Hmm. Okay. So it's almost let's go into a fantasy feel so I get out of the real feel, the real reality. Again, it's just a protection mode.
Right.
Wow. Hmm.
But it's very scary because you get very disoriented and it feels weird. So unfortunately, quite often it leads a person, quite often they'll end up with a panic attack. So now not only do they have the PTSD, they may have a panic disorder.
Yes. And the reason I even brought that up and wanted to, people have told it to me, people close to me have said that, and who are dealing with some challenges, that it feels like a dream. I feel like I'm in a dream. So it's obvious that there's a challenge going on, that they're escaping from it. And then do you find a lot of times people in these situations also gravitate toward um, a substance, whatever it might be, to help with an escape?
Well, people go to, substances for coping. The only problem with the substance is what was the solution becomes the problem.
Right. And even it might be a short-term fix, but there's also collateral situations where that substance could bring on depression. You think it's okay for the moment, but then when you come down from it, that brings on even more challenges. So, my thinking is get help, ASAP.
Yeah, invariably, people always say, I take the substance to take the edge off, right?
Sure.
It's so much. I always ask them, wouldn't you rather just take it all away
Right.
rather than just the edge?
100%. And you're just, you're not fixing the situation, the problem. You're just masking it. And I get it. I understand it. But like you said, take care of it, deal with it. Not comfortable. I understand that as well. But at some point, you have to face it. How do we connect with you, Roger?
I'm at drlavine.com. That's DoctorLavine.com.
Yeah. Normally I don't talk about a topic in 2 podcasts, but this one is so important, impactful, that I'm glad we went down that road today. Thank you so much for being here.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Too. Thank
Bye.
you. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
Mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.